Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is José Pablo Quesada Molina. I'm a PhD candidate from the 36th cycle under the supervision of Professor Stefano Mariani. And the topic for today's PhD talk is accelerating materials design with deep learning, multiscale modeling, and inverse design strategies. So in this slide, I want to provide a brief overview of the talk, in which we will explore the potential of deep learning in advancing multiscale modeling and design of heterogeneous materials, with a focus on both predictive and prescriptive tasks for the development of forward models and inverse models. This will be considered in terms of two study cases. The first study case examines the polysilicon films commonly used in microelectromechanical systems. And in this case, we will use convolutional neural networks to provide a surrogate model for homogenization in such a way that we can reliably link the microstructural characteristics of these materials to the macroscopic elastic properties. In the second study case, instead, we will present an inverse design framework for composite materials with periodic microstructures. And in this framework, we will integrate the convolutional neural network as a predictor module, and we will also integrate generative adversarial neural networks as the generative model in order to achieve targeting of materials with a specific combination of properties, accelerating the material discovery and optimization process. These two studies demonstrate how deep learning can accelerate material property prediction and design, and also we will emphasize the interplay between the data, specifically the training data availability, and the model generalization. The topic in general of my research activity is around deep learning strategies for multiscale modeling and materials design. And this topic is accomplished in terms of three general objectives. The first one is the investigation of supervised deep learning capabilities for the extraction of effective structure-to-property relationships, which we will refer to as SP relationships during the presentation, in order to model the response of heterogeneous materials. Also, I am interested to investigate the capabilities of unsupervised deep learning algorithms for the generation of high-fidelity synthetic data, and also to explore the interpolation and extrapolation capabilities. Once we complete these two objectives, then we can integrate everything into what is the third general objective of my research, which is how to integrate both the predictive capabilities and the generative capabilities into data-driven frameworks for multiscale modeling and inverse design. Particularly, this this research aims to address critical gaps in deep learning strategies for multiscale modeling and inverse design. Specifically from the literature, this can be divided into two main groups. Gaps related to the predictive task alone, which is related to forward models for extraction of SP relationships, or prescriptive tasks where we deal with inverse models for design and optimization. So in the first study case, we will address the gaps associated to predictive tasks, particularly the limited characterization of the ability of convolutional neural network-based models to generalize across diverse microstructures and transfer knowledge to new domains. And the other aspect is the lack of integration of CNN-based approaches into multiscale frameworks for homogenization. Conversely, for prescriptive tasks, we will address the lack of in-depth characterization of the effect of training data distribution in the interpolation and extrapolation capabilities of deep learning models within inverse design frameworks, and also the limited exploration of the latent space optimization strategies to achieve either near or extreme out-of-distribution targets. So in terms of the first study case, here we present a deep learning-based multiscale modeling of polysilicon structures with application in MEMS. This study case can be broadly summarized into these four main steps. In the first step, we will generate the dataset, which is essentially digital representation of polysilicon morphology. Here we will assemble an image dataset together with the target properties, which will be related to the effective elastic moduli of these microstructures. In the second step, we will demonstrate the search for the optimal CNN architecture through a hyperparameter tuning campaign. Once we have our dataset and our neural network trained, then we will perform in the step 3 and 4 the assessment of the results in terms of the extraction of SP relationships both in polysilicon stochastic volume elements, and then we scale up the analysis to present the extraction of the structure to property relationships this case in polysilicon structures, taking as an example the resonant structure of a Lorentz force-Mens magnetometer. So in terms of the first step, dataset generation, here we deal with the epitaxially grown polysilicon thin films. These films are characterized by a columnar growth, where one of the axes of axis symmetry can be regarded as remaining aligned with the growth direction, which in this case is represented by the third axis of the global reference frame in this diagram, while instead in the other two elastic symmetry directions display a random orientation in the x1, x2 plane. Moreover, if we analyze a very thin slice of this material, we realize that the in-plane morphology of this polycrystal can be regarded as a constant, and therefore we can address the mechanical characterization of such polysilicon thin films, in this case, within a two-dimensional frame. In order to reproduce this kind of morphology from a computational implementation, we perform a Monte Carlo procedure, which is exploited to account for the stochastic effects introduced by both the topology of grain boundaries and also the lattice orientations. Particularly, in order to obtain this, an average distance between the generator points when we are performing the tessellation is enforced in order to achieve an average grain size that is characteristic of the specific manufacturing process that we are characterizing in this case. And on the other hand, the in-plane lattice orientation is regarded as a random variable that can take values in between 0 and 2.5 in the plane. With these considerations, we can assemble datasets. For this study case, we assembled 3 different datasets with different granularity levels, characterized by this length scale ratio of L over SG, where L represents the characteristic length of the stochastic volume element, and SG is the average grain size. So we have 3 datasets of increasing level of granularity each. Next, in the images, we can encode, in the pixel values, we can encode the in-plane lattice orientation, which is related to the directional dependency of the effective Young modulus. In particular, if we analyze the directional dependency of monocrystalline silicon, we will obtain this kind of trend, analyzing the parity plot. And we will exploit this symmetry in order to provide some additional experimental tests, which I will present later on in the result part. With the microstructures, then we can move on and perform numerical homogenization in order to extract the target value that is going to be the objective for our SP relationships, which we will extract with the convolutional neural network. This is characterized specifically, the target is in terms of the Young modulus along the first axis of the global reference frame. And we can observe here the distribution or the histogram with the target distribution, where we see that essentially the distributions are characterized, all of the data sets have virtually the same mean value, but what varies significantly is the level of dispersion around the mean value for the different data sets, which is consistent to the fact that as we go with the smaller stochastic volume elements, we will have a larger scattering of the mechanical properties when performing homogenization. Next, we move to the selection of the deep learning model. In this case, we are using convolutional neural networks, which use convolutional layers to detect spatial patterns from the input by processing this input in a local manner. This is achieved through convolutional filters, also referred to as kernels, which are applied to small batches of the input in order to reduce the number of parameters associated to this architecture, which is why this type of architecture is preferred when we are analyzing images or spatially correlated data. Then also another characteristic of these neural networks is that they implement parameter sharing, which is done through the use of these convolutional kernels. Specifically, we use the same kernel that is applied to different regions of the input to generate each feature map, and this allows us to have a much more scalable model for high-dimensional data like images. And another characteristic of convolutional neural network is that these networks are able to extract features in a hierarchical manner. This can be better understood through this figure, where we observe that the receptive field, which is the portion of the image that is that affects a neuron in a given convolutional layer, is progressively increasing as we go deeper into the convolutional layers, And the effect of this is that the neural network is able to extract hierarchical features from low-level features to mid-level or high-level features. Then, in order to determine which is the model that we will use for our implementation in this study case, a hyperparameter tuning campaign is performed. This is important because when we train a neural network, there are internal parameters that are the ones that are adjusted to the training process, but there are some parameters that are associated, for example, to the architecture or other aspects of the training that are not updated during the training, and actually we have to decide for them prior to the trainer. So in order to optimize this architecture, this campaign is performed, and this is summarized in this parallel coordinate plot here, where basically each line represents a different configuration for the architecture that we try, and from all the samples or from all the trials, we determine the best performing one in terms of the one obtaining the lower validation loss, and we select this neural network for our subsequent parts of the study for the results. Then we move to assessing the performance of the convolutional neural network. Here we evaluate the structure property relationships at the material level. The results are presented in terms of parity plots. In these plots, we have in the x-axis the ground truth value, and in the y-axis the predictions by the convolutional neural network. And we observe a very good agreement between the data and the predictions of the CNN and the ground truth data obtained via finite element simulations. Next, we perform a series of experiments that are aimed to evaluate the generalization capabilities. The first experiment is one where we apply data augmentation to obtain from each original image 7 new instances, and then we compare the predictions of the CNN over the original image, and we compare that against the mean prediction on the augmented instances to understand if the CNN is capable to capture the physical invariance of the elastic properties. In this case, this procedure relies on the symmetry of the elastic properties that is tied to the monocrystalline silicon domain in such a way that the transformations that we are applying to the original image maintain each grain lattice orientation unchanged, and we allow the position inside the stochastic volume element to vary. And the underlying assumption of this experiment is that the effective elastic property of the stochastic volume element depends primarily on the internal lattice orientations rather than on their individual arrangement within the stochastic volume element. We observe a very good agreement between, the predictions of the CNN versus the ground truth data. The second experiment to evaluate the extrapolation capability of the deep learning model is one where we assemble a small test set of samples that are displaying constant pixel values. These samples, as you can see, are significantly different than the ones that were used for training the neural network. And in this case, what we want to understand is if the CNN is capable to provide accurate predictions and capture the nonlinear relationship between the lattice orientation of monocrystalline domains and the effective property associated to the Young modulus. We obtained very good agreement in the predictions with an average relative error lower than 1.5%. The third experiment that is performed in order to assess the generalization capability of this model is one where we introduce novel mesoscale characteristics by introducing a new granularity level. So if you remember from the initial slides, we assembled 3 different data sets characterized by different granularity levels. Here we created a completely new data set with a completely different granularity level, which is in between those used for the training. And we assess if the CNN is able to interpolate to these values, to these microstructures. And again, we obtain a very good agreement between the CNN predictions and the ground truth data computed through finite element simulations. And therefore, we conclude that the CNN is able to handle the microstructural variations effectively and is able to adapt to new conditions within the physics domain. Next, we scale up the analysis and then we perform extraction of structure to property relationships to the device level. Here we focus on a Lorentz force magnetometer, specifically on the resonance structure of this MEMS device. The motivation is that during the operation of this kind of device, a slender polysilicon beam, which is characterized by a much longer length than the width of the beam, is driven into resonance, and the solution associated to the dynamic response of this device, which is characterized, for example, in terms of the maximum oscillation amplitude, is influenced, among other factors, by the flexural and axial rigidities, which depend ultimately on the effective Young modulus along the axial direction in this structure. So, in order to reproduce this scenario and take it to our data-driven framework, again, 3 new data sets are generated featuring different geometries of beams with different in-plane dimensions in terms of their width and length, and their target values are computed against via finite element simulation. Then we propose a multiscale homogenization framework where we can take the beam structure, and in the first step, we divide this beam structure into a series of subregions. Each of these subregions is essentially, we can regard it as a stochastic volume element, and therefore we can use the pre-trained CNN, the one that I presented in the previous slide, to produce local prediction of the homogenized Young modulus across the resonant structure. So we obtain a vector of local predictions for this beam structure, and then we can perform a resampling operation where we map this vector of predictions to a higher dimensional space in order to obtain a new vector that accomplishes 2 functions. The first one is that makes the input to the CNN, the second CNN constant, and importantly, make this input independent of the actual physical dimensions of the resonant structure. And through this operation, then we are able to use this framework to perform homogenization across various length scales. In this case, again, we obtained a very good agreement between CNN predictions and ground truth values, achieving even average relative error lower than 0.5% for an additional test set that was assembled, characterized by very different features compared to the data used for training the CNN. So we conclude that it's able to generalize to new scenarios. The second study case is one where we present a deep learning-based design framework for composite materials with periodic microstructures. In this case, this can be summarized in terms of 5 general steps. In the first step, we generate unit cells characterizing composite materials with periodic microstructures. In the second step, very similar to the first study case, we will train a convolutional neural network to provide the structure 2 property mapping, so the predictor module, which is a CNN again, because we're dealing again with image data as input. But in this second study case, we incorporate also the addition of a generative model in order to obtain synthetic samples of the material that we are characterizing. And why this is important is because then we can take the predictor module and the generator model and integrate them into a design framework and then target materials with a specific combination of properties. This is studied in the step 4 of this study case. And in this last step, we present some strategies that we determine in order to enhance the performance of this impaired design framework, particularly for out-of-distribution targets. So, briefly, the first step, data set generation. Here we leverage a parametric generator tool to create this kind of Voronoi tessellation. This is going to be the structure of the material that we are simulating. This parametric generator tool is controlled or governed by essentially 2 different parameters. The number of seeds, which determines how many cells we will have in these structures, and the other one is the spacing from the edges, which essentially determines the thickness of these grain boundaries in these structures. So specific values of 4, 6, and 8 are assigned to the parameter associated to the number of cells, and specific constant values of 10, 20, and 30 pixels are given for the thickness of the grain boundary. This is important because then when we analyze the kind of images that the GAN, the Generative Adversarial Network, is able to generate, we will understand that this deep learning model is also able to incorporate new features completely different from the ones that we're used to train it. So we say that it's able to extrapolate, and this will confer important properties in order to target other points in the material property space, not characterized by the training data. The images generated with this parametric tool is then processed in order to obtain what we call the base pattern image. This is the image to which we assign the material properties. How do we encode them? Pixel values represented by color, by black color, represent the stiffer face of the composite structure. So PLA material is represented by black pixel, and PLA is polylactic acid, and the TPU is the thermoplastic polyurethane, is encoded in gray pixel colors. Next, we use the base pattern. We perform some reflection operations, and we use the resulting 4 images. We assemble them together to obtain the representative unit cell, which is essentially the unit cell characterizing the composite materials with the periodic microstructure. Once we have the images of the microstructure, we also perform numerical homogenization in order to obtain the target values associated to this data set of images. So we have now the 2 pieces of information that we need, both the structure and also the target values. And now we can, for example, represent the data set that we generated in a plane composed by the target properties, the properties that we will aim to optimize during the inverse design. And if we represent all the data set in this space, we can see that there are regions of the space that have very dense concentration of training data points, but there are other regions that are very sparse, where we don't have almost training data. And these are the regions that will represent an important challenge when we try to aim design and a design with displaying the characteristics here, because there is almost no data for the deep learning models to extract information and get these points. These 2 steps, as already introduced, the second step is, again, training a predictor module, which is based on a convolutional neural network. Again, a very good agreement is obtained for the 2 target properties. The target properties in this case are the Young modulus on the first axis of the global reference frame. And in order to introduce a kind of constraint in the optimization process, the second target property is the volume fraction of the stiff phase, in order to be able to target specific material properties by constraining also the volume fraction of one of the 2 phases. In terms of the generation of Born-inspired base patterns, we use a generative adversarial neural network. This architecture is characterized by 2 neural networks, a generator and a discriminator. The generator, what tries to do is to produce a high-resolution image from a very small vector that is called noise vector or latent vector. And the objective during the training of the generator is that this network learn to reproduce the true data distribution and therefore produce outputs that are indistinguishable from the real data. Conversely, the discriminator neural network is essentially just a conventional convolutional neural network that is trained for classification and is trained to classify accurately in between real data or original data, the one that we generated with the parametric Voronoi generator, or the fake data, which is the data that we are generating with the generative adversarial neural network. Over time, during the training, the generator output quality is improved because it receives feedback from the discriminator. Now, this is what I was mentioning before. Interestingly, these are all examples of images that are generated by the GAN after the training. And for example, we can see that for this set of images, these are essentially displaying the same features characterizing of the original data. So it's able to reproduce the features associated to the original data it was trained on. However, it's also able to introduce many new features in other type of images. So it's able to extrapolate. For example, it's introducing different number of cells, which were not part of the training set. It's also introducing a variable thickness of the grain boundaries, which is also not a characteristic that was used during the training. And even reproduce some path disconnected domains, which is also not present in the training data. Numerically, we can characterize that by comparing, for example, if we created a data set of 1,000 synthetic samples, and if we compute the effective properties associated to this synthetic sample, we observe that there is an increase in the range of variation of the effective properties compared to the range of variation associated to the original data, which is something very important and exactly what we need to exploit in order to achieve target points that are not part are not inside of the original training data distribution. So in this step, we integrate the already trained deep learning models. So in this part, the neural network models are already trained and their weights are frozen. We put them into a framework where we will target materials with new characteristics. And so how does it work? Basically, this block diagram represents the configuration. We depart from sampling the latent vector, which, if you remember, is the input to the generator model. We just sample a random latent vector, feed it to the trained generator, and so the generator is able to generate an image. This image will be predicted the effective properties by the already trained CNN, so we have the predicted of this random image. We have the predictions, we can compare them against target values, and then we can compute some kind of error metric and use that error metric to decide whether we need to resample the latent space because the initially sampled vector is too far from our objective, or if it's close enough, we can undergo an optimization process for the latent vector in order to even improve the approximation of the new pattern. In terms of the study, 4 steps were followed. First step is that we created a grid of target points, which is represented by these red dots in the material property space. And as you can see, these red dots are the target points. So there are target points that are well inside the distribution of the original training data, which we would expect we will have no problems to obtain this kind of designs here. But there are also many points that fall in scarcely populated regions of the material property space for which there would be a challenge for our inverse design framework. Next, for each grid point, we will decide to optimize 10 different latent vectors, and from this one, we will pick, from this optimization, we will pick the best performing latent vector in order to reconstruct an image, and from this image, reconstruct the associated unit cell characterizing the periodic material. Moreover, if we repeat this for all the target points in the material property space, we can create this kind of error plots that allow us to quantify the error across the material property space in order to correlate the accuracy of this framework with the availability of the training data. And how do we do that? In these plots, the radio of these circles here in color are proportional to the error. And the color is encoding the density of training data in the neighborhood of the target point. And therefore, in a single plot, we can observe the relationship between the accuracy of the framework when targeting new designs and the amount of, or the availability of training data associated to that particular target point. Next, as you can see, we obtain large errors for the points that are in the region where there is almost no training data. And then for the regions where there is a lot of data, we can see very small errors, both for the predictor module, so for the forward module, and also for the inverse module, which is the entire framework. So this is why we have 2 error plots here. So we obtain very big errors here, which is expected. And then the next thing we do is, okay, how can we prove these results? We have 2 strategies here. One strategy is to improve the accuracy of the predictor module itself. We achieve this by adopting active and transfer learning strategies to retrain the convolutional neural network. How do we do that? We include samples generated by the GAN into another training of the CNN in such a way that we incorporate all these new features that we saw the GAN was introducing in the new images. We introduce a small fraction, around 20% of new samples, synthetic samples in the original training dataset, retrain the convolutional neural network, and with this we can observe important decrease of the error, interestingly, both for original samples and for synthetic samples. So this is a very effective strategy to improve the predictor module, which is one of the components of the entire framework. The other component of the framework is related to the optimization of the latent vector. How can we improve this? Well, the first step is, as you remember in the previous slide, we just did the optimization of 10 latent vectors for 10 iterations. It was a very small campaign. Here we allow a larger exploration of the latent space, increasing the number of latent vectors and iterations. So in order to achieve this, instead of optimizing again for all the grid points that I presented in the previous slide, what we do here is that we just focus on the 4 most critical points of the entire first optimization campaign, which we decide to take 2 points close to the training data, so outside the training data but close, and 2 points in the extreme out of distribution region. These 4 points are the 4 points that have the largest error in the entire optimization campaign. So we focus only on this. We perform an extensive latent space exploration like this. Is shown in this image here. Now we don't have just 10 latent vectors and 30 iterations. We allow 100 latent vectors for 30 iterations. And we observe already an important decrease in the error associated to the design. For example, we here compare the design that we obtained in the first optimization campaign and the one that we obtained for the same point A, out of these 4 points that I identified in the previous slide. And we obtained a reduction of the error by 80% approximately. If we present the data for the 4th critical point that we picked, which were the one associated to the largest error, during the second optimization campaign, we obtained very good results, both for the framework and even for the predictor itself. All of the errors associated to these 4 designs are below 10% error, with an extensive exploration of the latent space, but it still could be even larger, so possibly these results can be even improved. And a large reduction of the error compared to the first optimization campaign. So just to provide some concluding remarks regarding the 2 studies. Regarding the first study case, we see that the CNN model demonstrated to have a strong extrapolation and interpolation capabilities with consistent accuracy across varying microstructure morphologies and scale. The CNN model was able to effectively generalize to new microstructures, which highlights the potential for transferability to new datasets. And CNNs can be effectively implemented in multiscale frameworks, integrating microstructural predictions with device-level behavior. And this will bridge micro and macro scale modeling, allowing for a scalable hierarchical applications. Regarding the second study case, where instead of just using the predictive part, we also incorporate the generative part to obtain this inverse design framework, we can conclude that active and transfer learning was very effective to improve the accuracy of the forward model. Importantly, the GAN-based samples enhance significantly the extrapolation capabilities of the inverse design framework by introducing new features in the synthetic data, so in the synthetic microstructures. This enables us to target new designs in both near out-of-distribution and extreme out-of-distribution regions of the material property space. And then regarding the exploration of the latent space, we observed that through random sampling and gradient-based design optimization of the latent space, we can obtain better designs. However, in between the 2 strategies, it was significantly better the optimization of the latent space rather than just a random sampling of it. This highlights the interplay between the optimization sensitivity and exploration strategies in this kind of framework. Thank you very much for your attention.
Is there any questions? Also from online, if there's any questions.
Well, I arrived very late.